This week's podcast guest is Jake Hertzog. He is a critically acclaimed guitarist, composer, educator, and writer based in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he teaches at the University of Arkansas. He has toured throughout the U.S., Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and India, and performed and recorded with a diverse cadre of artists, including Randy Brecker, Ivan Neville, Mike Clarke, Blondie Chaplin, Anton Fig, and many, many others. In 2016, Jake joined the music faculty at the University of Arkansas Fayetteville. In 2018, he authored his first book, Guitar Sound Effects, a deep dive into the world of contemporary guitar sounds and techniques. Under the alias Hey Jazz Guy, Jake has contributed over 30 articles to Guitar Player magazine, which coined him the jazz ambassador to the non-jazz world. Hertzog's classical recording, including Well Lit Shadow from 2016, is a suite for solo electric celebrating themes and images and particle physics. That's right, I said particle physics. His latest project, a guitar duo, is called Stringscapes, a portrait of the world in nylon and steel. It is a unique combination of nylon string and steel string guitars and is inspired by the landscapes of the planet Earth. Jake was co-leader and co-songwriter of the rock band The Young Presidents from 2009 to 2016. For 3 years, Jake stood as musical director and lead guitarist for Nickelodeon's The Naked Brothers Band. They concluded 2 national tours and have performed on national television shows including Good Morning America, The View, Nickelodeon's Kid Choice Awards, and The Today Show. He holds a performance degree from Berklee College of Music and a master's degree from the Manhattan School of Music in New York. Man, this guy was a great interview. As you can tell from his bio, he is a wealth of information about musicianship and artistry. So, without further ado, enjoy this in-depth interview with guitarist, composer, educator, and writer, Jake Hertzog. Oh, and I almost forgot, at the end of the interview, Jake has given us permission to play one of his songs, so stick around to hear Firefly from his 2011 album, Evolution. Here we go. Hey, man, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh man, what a pleasure! Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I was researching, artists that I was interested in for the show creatively, and your name came up when I saw that you were playing at the Griffin Restaurant at the Murphy Arts District in El Dorado this Thursday.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this particular show. Never been down that way before, and I think that. There's some wonderful things going on in that area with the arts and support of the arts, and it's really exciting to be a part of that.
Well, we're very happy to have you down here. I can't wait to see your show. But we get several musicians that come through here on a regular basis every month, and so if I wanted to interview all of them, I could probably make lots of phone calls and set up quite a few. But you in particular struck me as an interesting cat because. As I began to go through your bio before I reached out, I came across an album that I'd like to bring up and chat a little bit about because it's really what inspired me to want to talk to you. And it's, I believe it was your last solo release called Well Lit Shadow.
Oh, yes.
So the reason it caught my eye is because I'm going to be real honest, I don't listen to a lot of jazz. I've certainly seen some live jazz performances. I've been to some clubs, and occasionally I'll have it on in the house, but it's not always my go-to. And so when I saw that this was let me read the description because it really kind of set me off here. It's a suite of solo electric guitar tracks inspired by images from the Large Hadron Collider and other experiments from the CERN Practical Physics Lab. And I was like, well, I've got to listen to that. And so I spent an afternoon listening to it while I was doing some writing, and man, it's amazing. So what I wanted to ask to kind of get us started off here, and having gone through some of your other albums, and we'll talk about your newest project here, Stringscapes, in a bit, but your inspirations for your work, one, having science as being one of them, seem to be very specific. So what really draws you to a subject?
Well, that was kind of a full circle project for me because in a personal way, I've always that branch of physics is actually very much what my father does or was doing when I was younger. And so at the time when my dad was in the early part of his career, he actually worked at CERN. This is long before the Large Hadron Collider was built, but I was a very little kid, like 5 years old there. And we were living in Geneva at the time. And so, his work and the idea of that kind of science was always sort of inspiring to me into high school. And I thought one of my original life plans was maybe I'll try to become some kind of a scientist like my dad. I think a lot of kids grow up thinking they'll do whatever their dad did. And so as after I became more of a musician, that interest always stayed with me. And so I did my best to keep up with what I would call the popular science writers, so the kind of, and there's some really great ones out there that do a good job of explaining science and physics to the public. Neil Tyson DeGrasse is one of them. And folks like that. And so in as much as some scientists have a favorite band, I was like a musician with a favorite science, So when I was asking the question about solo guitar, I knew I wanted to make a solo guitar record. And I had been working with other kinds of programmatic music at the time. But I said, what would be an appropriate theme for this? And there's something about the idea of not being the scientist, but I thought, what if I was the particle? And what a lonely existence that would be. And so that singularness to me had a lot to do with the idea of one person playing one instrument. And so that's where the original idea for that project came from. So I wrote one piece, and then it seemed like there was more to explore. So I wrote a bunch of them, and then the ones that kind of coalesced together became the whole suite, which is the Well Lit Shadow record. And I wanted to sort of treat the electric guitar as if it were a classical instrument there. So it's an electric guitar, but it's the recording and the playing is done as if it was an acoustic guitar, if that makes any sense.
It does. No, I listened to it right after I discovered it, and there are certainly moments where you can hear the flair of the electric guitar that might sound a little different on acoustic, but so much of it that really makes a lot more sense in my head now, that idea of being the particle. For anybody, I encourage everyone to go listen to it directly after this, and you can, if you imagine that, you can certainly kind of feel how you kind of maybe are getting ping-ponged around by other forces that are other movements within the album.
Yeah, well, there was interesting aspects to explore there in terms of the generic process, and I wouldn't claim to understand every nuance of the science, but essentially the idea that these particles go around in a circle at the speed of light, slam into each other, and then we measure them. I mean, there's something that's so intrinsically interesting about that like we're getting the answers to the greatest mysteries of the universe by measuring things that are so infinitesimally smaller than we can even perceive or comprehend. And so that dichotomy is fascinating too. And then we get into like, well, what are the real limits of our knowledge? We keep building bigger and bigger machines. And where will we find the limit there? So as an artist, there's like this overwhelming number of angles you can take on that. So some of those pieces are quite literal. The one that's called "What We Found," to me, that's a kind of a literal attempt at trying to have what does a particle sound like when it's going around at the speed of light. And then others have more of a philosophical kind of idea. And to me, the loneliness is central in that. I sometimes think of, I'm trying to remember the name of the book. Bill Bryson. There's a wonderful author, Bill Bryson, and he's got several books. And one of them's called, I think it's something like A Short History of Nearly Everything.
I think I've read that.
Yeah, and so one of the things that's a wonderfully well-written book for the fan of science. But one of the things that's so interesting to me about it is there must come a moment in every discovery where, like, if you make a discovery, you're the only one in the world that knows that thing. right? And so, in very much keeping with the theme of what are the secrets of the universe, I imagine what must that be? What must that be like? Whether that's it for an hour before your colleagues know, or it for 2 weeks before the paper gets published, or it for 6 months before it comes out in the New York Times. I mean, there must be something lonely about that too. You discover another layer of the mysteries of existence, and then you go, wow, how on earth can I disseminate this, and will it make any sense if I do?
Absolutely. I can see that you have an understanding of layers of the universe in a way that others don't. And not only are you the only person that knows this, now you are wholly responsible for relaying that information in an understandable fashion to others.
Yeah, and it's just kind of wild. So, and there's something similar about art and improvisation too, in the sense of, if you're a composer or an improviser, you are the only person in the world at that moment playing that thing that you just played. And so there's some kind of philosophical and intellectual parallel there between the thrill of a scientific discovery and the thrill of an improvised music that only ever happens once.
So to dive a little bit more into that inspiration of the idea, were you looking for a solo project and playing with the ideas, or was this an idea that struck you that caused a solo project?
I would say it was a little bit of both, because I had other solo guitar music, and I was trying to decide if it was worth it to turn it into a whole project or just something to play here and there on some shows. And then I had what really sealed the deal for me was, and this goes back again a little bit to childhood memories. I used to sometimes after school go to where my dad had an office at the University of Illinois, and I would just sit around and wait to be taken home. And when I would walk through the hallways, there were other scientists that were in this branch of science, and there were these beautiful pictures that weren't really meant to be pictures. They were just they were like the mathematical image readouts of all these particle collisions, right? But because this was their current research, they were gigantic pictures in the hallway. And so to my uneducated brain, I thought, oh, what cool pictures,
It was your artwork in the halls, sure.
Yeah, it was. And so then that leads me out on another tangent, but the great jazz pianist Phil Markowitz, I had the pleasure of being one of his students for a while in New York. And he shared with me music that he had written based on Mark Rothko paintings, which is a super interesting artist. And so that to me flipped the switch of like, oh, like maybe I can do something with the visual inspiration. And so then I thought about these particle collision images, like, well, that's something meaningful to me. So let me run with that.
Right, that's interesting. So that inspiration of walking through the hallways and seeing what is scientific readout information on the walls, but not being able to comprehend it, you read as artwork. And so similarly, you've done so with your music. That's interesting. It's I can certainly see the correlation. It's interesting how it developed for you in that way. Speaking of education, you've had a stellar education, both at Berkeley and then at the New York School of Music. And what about professors or teachers, mentors? Who have you worked with that's most inspired you?
Man, I have been so lucky in my life with that. And there's a great old Chinese proverb that sort of says, "When the student is ready, the master will appear." And I have very much lived that in music and in non-music ways. So I had really kind and generous, compassionate teachers when I was in high school music programs and what have you. But what really drew me to Berklee College of Music was the guitarist Mick Goodrick. And Mick Goodrick is, if there's such thing as a Master Yoda of jazz guitar, he would be it. He was in Gary Burton's band early on, and I believe this was the 70s or so. And he took up kind of a residence in Boston, teaching at Berklee and New England Conservatory, and he's more or less done that ever since. And many of his alumni became the most well-known of the jazz and fusion guitar players of that period. So folks like Pat Metheny and Mike Stern and John Schofield, Bill Frisell, John Abercrombie. It's sort of like the Mount Rushmore of jazz and fusion guitar players. Many worked with him. So to me, that was a big deal to get a chance to study with him. And then after that, in sort of a similar circumstance, this is much later, but at the Manhattan School, they've had Dave Liebman as an artist in residency for a while, kind of a long-standing thing. And his music always, to me, was just some of the most fascinating, coloristic, intricate, deep, heavy music of all the jazz musicians. And I admire that he wrote classical music and he played jazz and he played with Miles and he did all kinds of different groups in his career. And so, again, the opportunity to work with him really drew me to the Manhattan School at that time. And I had other really great folks, Chris Rosenberg, the former music director for Ornette Coleman. I got to be a student of his for a while. There's classical guitarist Mike Lorimer, and then other people who really taught me on the bandstand. So one of my greatest teachers, I never took a class with him, but was the great jazz pianist Michael Wolff. And it was sort of a funny story. Like at the time, I was the music director for his children, who were quite famous as teenage pop stars. And so I had a professional gig working with his children, but Mike being one of the great jazz pianists, like we got along well, and he would show me things, and we played some shows together, and he actually appeared on my first record, and he introduced me to some of the musicians that ultimately I ended up working a lot with when I lived in New York. So that, again, like I've had many wonderful master-apprentice relationships in my life, and some in schools and some nothing to do with schools.
So, one of the unique things about I think your education is that you are now an educator. So, on top of the inspirations they've given you as a musician, is there anything as an educator that they have lent you that you now utilize when you're working with your students?
That's a great question. Yes, and I'll bring up Michael Wolff again, and another incredibly gifted talent that I worked with for a long time, Victor Jones. And so one of the main things that is close to my heart about education and jazz education is just there's something intangible about the art and the culture of jazz and jazz history. And there's something about the way that musicians really have to you can only learn certain things through live performance, and you can only learn certain things through playing with people that are better than you, and you can only learn certain things through not just studying the recordings, but then trying to work in the style of those recordings or reproduce that yourself with another group or what have you. So and so much of the culture of jazz has this sort of oral and oral tradition on one hand, and then it has been codified and institutionalized to some extent in the past 4 or 5 decades on the other hand. And so the student of jazz faces the dichotomy of those two modes of learning, one being the classroom, where I can take you to the classroom and teach you all the theory, but then the other was sort of the blood, sweat, and tears of it, where you need to be up on that bandstand with more experienced musicians, struggling for dear life, and then eventually you get there. and so to me, one of the things that I was so privileged to learn from really great musicians who were generations removed from me, like Michael Wolff, Victor Jones, a great jazz drummer, Barry Outchell, who was one of the original like free jazz kind of musicians among decades of other work, Dave Liebman, et cetera. And one of the recurrent themes that I always felt like they tried to pass on was to keep that oral and aural tradition part of the education of this music, and not let it get completely institutionalized, classroomized, bought and sold, packaged with the bow on it. I mean, that's not it in some sense.
It sounds a little familiar to me, somewhat like, because all my education is in performing arts as an actor or directing, and so it sounds very similar to taking some improvisational classes where you have various schools, whether it be the Upright Citizens Brigade or Second City, and they have certain manners with which they teach. But in the same sense, it's still improvisation, and there's still a history behind it, and there's still some traditions that you just can't learn unless you are in front of an audience and you are trying it out. And it sounds like jazz musicianship, coming from that same type of history, I get a sense that there may be some similarities there, that you have to go through that blood, sweat, and tears on a bright lit stage in front of an audience with your betters in order to begin to learn what it really means.
Yeah, absolutely. And one day before I sort of moved and took this job, I was having lunch with Michael Wolff, and I said, "Hey, what advice do you have? Give me some teacher advice." And he said, "Well, Jake, keep it street." And what he meant was, like, keep the grittiness inside this music. And I think that almost every great jazz musician will have a few stories from their early education where they were playing with people more experienced than them, and they got I don't want to say embarrassed, but at least they were blown out of the water in some sense.
Okay, well, you can't lay that out there without giving us one. Surely you've got some war stories.
I got one. So but then through that, they learn. I mean, there's a famous story about Charlie Parker in his when he was very young, going to jam session and basically not realizing there was more than one key or something, as the legend goes. And so he goes back and practices for several weeks, months, whatever it was, and then comes back and blows everybody away because he started to become Charlie Parker at that point. But those kind of experiences that, when you really dig into the myth and the lore of, like, the jam sessions in Harlem and the cutting contests and these cats that were really, I mean, it was an experiential kind of tradition, and you picked up what you picked up because you were emulating the people that were better than you, or more competent than you. And so in as much as we can in jazz education to give people knowledge and context and an understanding of the technical, theoretical components of the music, that stuff translates very well to institutions and to curriculum. What is more difficult is to give them those experiences. And so in my approach, which of course I'm learning every day, but I want to always try to keep that in the conversation somewhere, whether it's we create jam sessions for students here, and we try to, work that kind of ideas into our improv classes and our ensembles and that type of thing. But I think at some level, then you have to just let them go, and they're going to take what you give them, and then they're going to go have that experience, and hopefully they'll be prepared. They'll have an experience that blows them away, but not so much that they don't come back.
Right.
And they can maintain that fire, and they use it as something to expand their artistry with.
It's a fine line between being scorched by the fire and just getting a little singe.
And so I'll tell you my story about that, which
Please.
is kind of funny. So, because I figured you were going to ask. So when I was in high school, I was studying with the great saxophonist and educator Chip McNeil, who had been in Maynard Ferguson's band, Arturo Sandoval's band, and was one of those really just like incredible jazz educators. and he was quite a amazing technician on the saxophone for sure. And so he would play gigs with me, and he was really great about that. He always would play with students, and he would include students in his band for exactly the reason that I just described. You know, he wanted to pass on that experience to the students by playing at a really high level and challenging the students to keep up, so to speak. So one night I was, I think it was actually my gig, and I don't remember how old I was, maybe 15 or 16 or something, if even. But the great trumpet player John Faddis was visiting the town for a concert in the Performing Arts Center. So their gig must have finished, and they came over to the jazz bar that I was playing in. And I look out, and John Faddis is in the audience, and he decides that he wants to sit in. And so I said, all right, this is going to be fun. You know, I'm already scared out of my mind. And then my teacher, Chip McNeil, is there with me. So I thought, okay, well, you know what? At least Chip is here. I'm gonna, I'll just follow him, and he'll make sure I don't blow it. You know.
Yeah.
And so Chip calls meanwhile he wants to just play with John Faddis, right? So he calls a tune that I don't know in a key I don't know it in, super fast. And the other guys in the band were graduate. I think they were graduate students. So I was like the little kid in the band. Yeah. But so they start burning on Invitation, which at that time I didn't know that tune. And I'm like, oh no, I'm in trouble. So I'm flipping through, a songbook for the first 16 bars, just trying to figure out what song we're playing. And then it gets to my solo, and I just get like, I tried, man, but I'm sure it was horrendous. And so at the end of the night, I went over and I thanked John Faddis for coming out, and he said to me, "Go listen to Grant Green."
Isn't it interesting how those experiences can be such like character?
Is a big part of that, but yeah. So and that kind of experience, maybe without the defeatism that accompanies them sometimes, but that's very much part of the jazz tradition, and that's of course not the only thing, but it does speak to the intimate nature of the music, and how it really does take that kind of master apprentice relationship in some form to develop an artist, and whether that's Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock, or Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, or Gary Burton and Pat Metheny. I mean, like almost every great artist has their constellation of various mentors, and who are usually just the people who they were playing with when they were in their formative years. Every time they were that young person in the group, you graft off of the older, more experienced players. So those are the kind of experiences that we strive for in jazz education, but they remain elusive, and so it takes building more personal connections and more musically intimate connections than you can build in a theory class, for example. So
sure. So let's take a detour for a second. You have had a pretty wide history in music, playing in a variety of different genres, everywhere from the Young Presidents, and then I found your work with the television show on Nickelodeon, the Naked Brothers Band. And so, which I remember being on the air. And so, tell me a little bit about that, because you've moved around a bit from different genres. And not that that's a complete new thing, but each artist has their own journey. So, tell me a little bit about how you kind of wound from one genre to the next, and then your ultimate decision to make jazz your true focus.
Well, thanks for asking that. So I was sort of one of those people that just loved just about every kind of music there was. And as a kid, my record collection was essentially, I didn't really discriminate between one record and another. Like Bruce Springsteen, cool. Shostakovich, cool. I'm into that. Wes Montgomery, all right. James Taylor, okay. So to me, that it ended up influencing what I studied and what I ultimately ended up playing. And so I loved playing improvised music, but I loved writing songs. And I wrote a lot of. I had a rock band as a kid and a jazz band, and I've pretty much always, since 15 years old, had some version of a rock band and some version of a jazz band.
Mm-hmm.
But then from a very practical standpoint in the music industry, I realized that there was some marketability there, and if I was interested in playing pop music, that could lead to some different kinds of music industry experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was coming up on graduating from Berkeley, I sent out just blanket hundreds of demo tapes to anybody who I could get a phone number for, that were just that essentially said, "Hey, I'll play anything. I want to play anything. Looking for work.
Have guitar, will play."
Yeah, basically. And a great guitar player who has since unfortunately passed away, Jeff Golub. And Jeff was a guitarist and music director for Rod Stewart, but also a smooth jazz guitar player. And he and I developed a relationship, and he was a great model of somebody who sort of had a pop career as behind a major act like Rod Stewart, but also had a solo career. Mm-hmm. And I always looked at musicians like him saying, well, that could be a very good model, because if I'm not selling enough concert tickets under my own name, I can at least play for somebody who might be. Mm-hmm. So he introduced me to Michael Wolff just about the time where that show was taken off for Naked Brothers, and it worked out really well because they were in need of some, shall I say, well-trained but adults that also weren't like in their 50s, right, to play with the kids and tour with them and stuff. So I ended up taking that gig, and I found 3 other really talented musicians in New York, similar age and similar place in their careers, and that was the band for I guess the whole time. And that was just an amazing experience. I think I can probably speak for all of us when I say that because we were all working in sort of clubs and bars, and in New York, the Bowery scene, the Lower East Side scene, the jazz scene, whatever we were doing. And then we were suddenly the next day on these tours with the Naked Brothers, where we were playing in arenas and huge theaters and the sorts of venues that major acts would play. So that was a tremendously exciting experience.
And I think that's important to note. I mean, the show was only on the air, I think, for 2 or maybe 3 years, but you guys did a tremendous amount of traveling. Yeah.
And it was, we did bus tours and fly-ins. So depending on whatever we were doing. And it was interesting. It was interesting for us to see how that part of the business worked, and then also how it interfaced with television, because at the time it's not that kind of idea had never been tried, but they were among the first in the class of what became extraordinary conversions from television to music. So Jonas Brothers, Miley Cyrus, Selena Gomez.
They truly were. I mean,
it was this whole scene. Similar to that, musically, this is not a good analogy, but culturally it is similar to the grunge thing or the boy band thing a decade earlier. You had the success of one act inspired the proliferation of artists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recall that time period in film and television. It was kind of the advent, or maybe the population of reality television was really taking off, and that really did spawn that television to popular music artist trajectory that now has become very much a norm.
Yeah, and so, from looking back on it from a business model standpoint, from a record industry standpoint, that was kind of interesting, just abstractly very interesting. But but it allowed me to kind of scratch that itch of playing kind of pop and rock music. But at the same time, I had a working jazz group and I played with other independent, like I guess indie bands, singer-songwriters at that time. And so I just sort of loved playing whatever I could. But to me, anything with my name on it really was like, well, I thought I'm an okay singer, but maybe I'm not the best singer. I'm an okay actor, but I'm never going to be DiCaprio, but I can play guitar. Like that's my thing. So that became more and more the improvised music and the kind of the boundary between jazz and rock and now classical. Like that's my little liminal space there. But to me, it was never really about wanting to choose one team or another. It was more about how much can I bring into what I'm doing and where can I draw inspiration from.
Just out of curiosity, since you kind of looking at the history of your career, you have done a tremendous amount of traveling, both internationally and here in the States, with a variety of different groups. Do you have any kind of practices or things that you kind of bring with you on the road to make sure that you can kind of keep things together when you're moving from gig to gig?
Well, I would say for me, there's something kind of peaceful about being in motion. But whether that means you're sitting on a plane or waiting to get on a plane or on a train somewhere or in a bus, but I always needed something to do. So I would try to set up small practice goals or project goals for whatever time I had to spend in motion, whether I'm sitting on a plane or in the back of a tour bus or whatever. And I would say, all right, well, I got 2 hours before we get to the next city. This is a good time to either A, play all my major scales in every key, or B, work on this song that I can't think of an ending to, or C, read this book that I still haven't gotten out of my suitcase after 3 weeks. So to me, there always had to be something going on in those empty spaces. And, because if you tour a lot, and if you tour a lot, I'm talking Matheny level tour where you're 300 days a year playing shows. I mean, that's kind of a mentally grueling thing. So to me, the peacefulness came from having just like these little small things to try to occupy some of that time with, because you don't, when you're playing on stage, it's fantastic and it's worth every inconvenience that it took you to get to that stage. But when you're sitting at an airport on the third flight and it's delayed and now you're not going to get to Kansas City till tomorrow and you're thinking, gosh, I could be with my family right now. Oh man, this is brutal. So then that to me is where it takes, I think, some level of mental discipline to have continuously creative things to occupy that time with. Well, I don't know if that's the question you asked.
No, it is. It is. And that's kind of what I was going, is because, I can only imagine, my last job that I had to do a little bit of travel, but it wasn't anything compared to a lot of the friends I have that are all a variety of different type of artists that do a tremendous amount of traveling. And it can be taxing. Anyone who travels knows how taxing it can be, trying to go from flight to car to cab to finally to hotel, and then dealing with all the kind of things in between. But I suspect that you might have some unusual or strange stories about those times.
Well, there's always one of my favorite small talk things with other musicians is, tell me your weirdest gig. Like, what was the weirdest thing that ever happened? So, and so, one of the beautiful things about being an artist, I think an artist of any kind, is you don't really occupy any specific place in human society, but you also occupy all of them.
Hold on a second. Explain that for a second. Say that again. I'm kind of curious where you're going there.
Well, artists get to transcend different kinds of people and different, more than almost any other kind of occupation. Like, you get to you get to you can witness fabulous wealth and fabulous poverty. You can witness, all like every culture in the world. You can witness. I mean, you can just float into different human spaces. And as an artist, there's something about that that's very natural. And most artistic journeys coincide with, like one day you're busking on the streets of New York, and the next day you're selling out Madison Square Garden, or that, like, just that journey alone could be crazy. Or people that travel around, and I was just at a guitar festival for 4 days, and every single one of those artists had some fascinating journey that led them to be in Arkansas just at that moment. And so to me, that's one of the beautiful things about having a life in music is you get to meet such a wide range of people. You get to bear witness to all sorts of aspects of the human condition. What just the nature of traveling. I played a lot of. I did a tour of India, and what you see there, if you're not accustomed to developing countries, is just eye-opening. And what you see in Europe versus what you see in Latin America, what you see in just what you see in different parts of the United States. Playing a gig in New York is not the same as playing a gig in Oklahoma City or some bar in a town full of 12 people. So so there's something beautiful about that intrinsically. There's something that enriches your humanity by having contact with such a wide range of other human beings living other experiences. I forgot what the question was now.
No, we'll get back to it. I had to divert you for a second because what you said sounded profound in some manner, and so I wanted to dig in a little bit because I certainly understand there is something unusual about working in a profession where you can experience extreme speed followed directly afterwards by extreme silence. And doing it in a variety of different places where you have to be open to different ideas and different cultures and different people. And you can't be I think in order to be an artist of any quality, despite what your discipline is, you do have to be open. You cannot be a closed person, and that's one of the things I also love about artists and about being in this world is I get to talk to people like yourselves, is because it's not just great stories, but there is a sense of wonderment and a sense of openness that's required in order to do what you do. And so I think what happens then is your life experiences become richer and bolder if you can handle the psychological trauma that being an artist can also induce.
Yeah, well, I mean, like drilling down on that. I mean, I think that now more than ever, our societies are more conscious of maybe some of the divisions that between people, and sometimes it's very clear cut, like just divisions of wealth, for example. But there's more nuance to it too, and so you can imagine. And this is not an insult at somebody who might be an investment banker, but you can imagine. Let's say if I'm an investment banker, I might spend a lot of my time surrounded by other people who are also investment bankers or have something to do with that world. And that's all fine and good, but when you have a lot of that going on at every level of society, and there's not as much connection between, and there's not as much empathy and so in between groups of people, and so one of the things that artists get to do is cross those borders, and become sometimes even the translators of empathy between one group and another.
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons that whether people like it or not, artists tend to speak in bold statements with loud opinions because that's kind of our job.
Absolutely, no argument there.
You were about to tell us a crazy road story, I believe, before I interrupted you with a philosophical journey about artistic endeavors.
Well, I mean, this will kind of speak to my point there. So I toured for a little while with a Jordanian piano player who was the music he played was sort of a combination of what would be almost like pop type piano, but then with a lot of traditional Middle Eastern influences. So the ensemble was eclectic. There was a string section, an American rock and roll rhythm section, which was my job. But then there was also about 6 or 7 people playing Middle Eastern instruments, ouds, flutes, dulcimer, etc. So it was a really neat project. And we did some touring in the United States and also some things in Jordan, which was his home country. And one of the things that we played, and I don't remember how this gig came about, but we were playing, that was the introduction of Mercedes high-end vehicles to the country of Jordan. Like they were opening up their first Mercedes maybe shop or something like that in the country of Jordan. And so there was this beautiful venue right on the Dead Sea and in Jordan, and you can maybe a half hour or hour outside of Amman, and you can see Israel on the other side. You can see the lights of the Israeli cities on the other side of that. Sorry, a car just drove by me. I apologize.
It's okay.
So we set up and we play, and there's a huge room full of people. And at one point, they're talking and getting boisterous at after dinner, as could happen sometimes when you're celebrating. And it got so
understood.
bad.
I've been known to celebrate.
That the band leader stopped the band, yelled at the crowd in Arabic, something that I didn't understand, but probably to the nature of, sit down and shut up or we're not going to play for you anymore. And then we ended up playing one more song and then just left the gig early. And I just thought, boy, that was out. Like that was the most out thing I've ever seen. Because, some of us had flown, like just flown in for this particular show. And we were sitting there looking at each other like, what is going on? It's just bizarre. And so, but there again, we have like this group of musicians, some from America, some from Lebanon, some from Latin America, Africa. And we're sitting there, we're all kind of working musicians, right? And we're playing for the international executives of Mercedes-Benz. And anyway, it was just sort of, it goes to illustrate that point. Like you just get to meet some fascinating characters along the way.
I'm sure Mercedes-Benz was outrageously excited at your early exit after flying you all in from all over the world.
Yeah, I don't really know how that shook out on the other end because, sometimes when you're in the band, that's not your problem, which can be nice.
Yep.
But yeah, it does make for a funny story.
So tell me, when did you begin to pursue becoming an educator?
Well, a little bit by accident, in the sense that when I did do tours, frequently a stop or two would be at a college or some kind of a school, even sometimes a high school or something, and we would give a workshop, and inevitably I would end up talking to the faculty, and I always thought, well, these folks seem like they're having a great time doing this every day, and full disclosure, both of my parents are university professors, not in music, but so I grew up a little bit with the knowledge of that was an occupation somebody could do, and so then I was sort of thinking, well, I love all kinds of music. I have some specific expertise here and there, and I really like teaching more and more. I should think about, getting into the higher education game, and I knew that I wasn't particularly interested in teaching K-12 because the mission can be a little different. But teaching students in a higher ed setting, to me, felt a lot like producing records. Like I have this developing artist that I get to mold a little bit, and I can play that kind of producer role for them almost. And I love that experience when I'm producing records and working with other artists. I I always found that to be one of the most gratifying things to do in the music world. And so to me, higher education hit all those marks. Like, well, I can work in many styles of music. I can deal with young artists and play that kind of mentoring / producing role, but I get to throw in the technical education part in there too, which is something that I like and I have always enjoyed. So let me see about that. And higher education being what it is, there's a few jobs in any given field in any given year. It's never a very long list.
Yeah.
And so I remember talking to my wife one day. We were living in Manhattan, and I said, "Hey," I said, "I see there's a job here, University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Let me read you the description." And I'm reading to her about the hiking trails and the Ozark Mountains and all this. She goes, "That sounds pretty good. I think you should apply for that." So that's how I came to be at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville.
What do you have any specific missions or directives that you're trying to bring to that program that you want to highlight?
Sure. So a little bit of that goes back to my mentor Michael Wolf's comment about keeping it street. So we're super excited to announce the launch of our jazz concentration degree, which is a Bachelor of Music and Performance with a Jazz Studies concentration. And that's been something that our institution has wanted to have for a long time. And it took a lot of group work and new hires, including myself, to bring that to the floor. So that's up and running now, and we're super excited to promote that. I've been involved heavily in initiatives in our unit to engage more deeply with the music industry. So this has included both curricular and co-curricular efforts. So on the curricular side, we have several online courses in development at this time that are music industry related: pop songwriting, music law, music business, entrepreneurship, subjects like that. We have the wonderful and inestimable Al Bell from Motown Records and Stax Records.
Oh, wow.
Working with us on these. He was a visiting professor last year, and now he's going to be teaching an online course for us in the music business. And then we have co-curricular things too. We've gotten more internships working. We've gotten a music business club that brings in guest speakers. And so to me, I really want to help be a conduit for our students to not just think about music excellence in the abstract, but music excellence in career paths and all the different things you can do in the entertainment industry. You might come in with a guitar playing Charlie Parker, but you might come out writing music for films, or, there's just so many, or you might be an artist manager or a tour manager or a sound engineer or a arranger or, somebody who writes music for advertisements. I mean, there's so many options for musicians and what they can do with the music education that I really feel like I want to be inclusive of all of those things and make students aware of all those things.
Well, it sounds very similar to your career as well. It does. Between the music directing for Nickelodeon to working with rock bands to all these articles that I've been reading now that you were writing on Guitar Player. I mean, you've got an educator and touring jazz musician. You've got a lot of things going on there.
Yeah, well, I think that I am. Dare I say, relatively typical in the sense that people, even instrumentalists that have specific skill sets, end up doing a lot of different kinds of work. And sometimes it's because they enjoy it. Sometimes it's because they have multiple passions within music. And sometimes it's just because you can only play the same gig so many times before you can't stand it anymore. But I think
that's also a plight of the artist.
Yes, it sure is. But our the way that that music and higher education sort of evolved, there's like these major areas of performance, composition, and music education, and other fields have been slower to come into the fold, like jazz or music industry or arts administration. I mean, these are in the landscape somewhere, but they're not always at every institution. They're not always in every program, and so not every student gets to exposure to like the huge number of other types of music careers. And so one of the things that is always on my mind is, what is student success in the 21st century for a musician and somebody coming out of music school? Well, that's at the very least, that's a knowledge of the kinds of things they can do with their training and their talent. And at the very best, that's helping create the pipeline to really get them into whatever they want to do. They want to play for pop artists, if they want to work with symphonies, if they want to write music for movies, if they want to produce records, or and I think that for me, having a wide range of personal experience and having worn a bunch of hats helps me a lot in trying to illuminate those possibilities for students.
Well, I think that is extremely important. I know that in my education through theater and film, that was one of the things that I think that educational industry had not figured out when I was going through it, is the understanding of all the other possibilities of work. And there was too much emphasis on a particular individual tasks and not so much on the whole, especially at younger ages. So I think that's a great thing to be doing. So I will say, Jake, we're getting a little short on time, but I don't want to, if you've got a couple more minutes, I'd love to talk to you about your Stringscapes, your new project called A Portrait of the World in Nylon and Steel, and the nylon and steel being the strings, obviously, for the guitars. I had an opportunity to listen to some of it this morning. It's divided up into 4 major works called inspired by landscapes, extreme landscapes. So there's one for forest, Arctic, oceans, and desert. And, it's, again, going back to that idea of inspiration. I read about the album before I listened to a single note. And I think if this had been a multiple choice where I knew that it was one of the 4, and someone just put the music on without showing me the title, I could have guessed properly. It was.
Well, that's quite a compliment.
Especially when I got to Arctic, I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly what that should sound like. There were a couple of moments where I was kind of baffled at how exact it was. So tell me a little bit about the album, where it came from, and I believe you have a partner on it as well, obviously, because there's 2 guitars.
Yeah, well, so after Well Lit Shadow, I thought, well, there's a very simple next step. After recording a record of 1 guitar, you make a record of 2 guitars.
Well thought out plan, sir. Well thought out plan.
Yeah, just simple. That was probably the easiest possible direction I could have gone in. Required the least amount of foresight. But what actually made it happen was I developed a friendship with an incredible classical guitarist from Israel named Yishai Fisher. And, much like my attitude toward jazz of trying to be a rebel without a cause a little bit, he felt that way with classical music. And he's done a lot of interesting things with other Israeli and Jewish composers and kind of some off the beaten path stuff himself. But he's just a marvelous player. And so I wrote a one piece for us to play together, and I thought I'd play it on nylon string, but it worked out that I ended up playing it on steel string, and it sort of had this. It became almost like a new instrument, the sound of those 2 timbres together, they're so different that it ends up, you land somewhere between a harpsichord and a harp and some other weird, like a dulcimer. I mean, there's just weird timbres that come out of that, and so I thought, well, this is a really good excuse to, try to explore some things that I can't do with 1 instrument myself, that would be more possible if it was a piano or 2 mallet instruments and that kind of thing. And so the landscapes idea came to me out of I felt like, well, we after doing the particle physics thing, that was so abstract. That requires some real leap of faith, a little bit on the part of the listener, to just, first of all, imagine the science and then imagine what it sounds like. And so the landscapes to me was opposite. Like the idea of landscape is one of the oldest things in all of art and artistic expression. And, and sometimes we judge some of the greatest visual artists by their landscapes, and some have done mostly landscapes in their career. And so I thought, well, that's just like a genre of art that if I'm an artist, maybe I should have something to say about that. Like I imagine if I was a painter, I'd probably be asked to do a landscape at some point in my education of painting. So to me, I thought, well, let me just pick some very different colors. I remember going through like all the Planet Earth documentaries, looking for images and stuff, pausing it, playing it, like, ooh, like glaciers. Okay, what is that? What might that sound like? Oh, like the desert one came out of my wife grew up in Salt Lake City, so we've done a lot of hiking in the southern Utah area, and that area looks like Mars. There's the big moonscapes of these huge red rocks, and then the oceans to me was sort of self-explanatory. I'd lived a lot on the coasts, and so I gotten to experience some of that. And to me, the last movement, the forest, was written after I moved to the Ozarks, and I'm sitting there. I traded my apartment on 81st Street for this like backyard with overgrown honeysuckle bushes that were so thick I can't even see the neighbor's house. And so I wake up and I don't see any houses. All I see is trees out my window, and even though there's a house there, they're so thick. I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool. So, so they're all just very, very tangible references to my own places I lived or traveled, and so then what was fun was trying to imagine, okay, what would that sound like? And now I don't have the limitation of what I can play myself. The other interesting part of that project was it was much like with the Well Lit Shadow record was I usually market myself and my music as improvised music, but there's almost nothing improvised on either of those records. It was all composed. And so to me, the challenge of going from writing for one instrument to writing for two guitars, and then really working with somebody who was not really an improviser and wanted everything written out, that changes the approach to the music, because then it becomes codifying it to make it sound like some things are improvised, even if they're not.
There was some moments I felt like there was almost like a call and response written into some of the music, for sure, where it felt like the two different instruments were playing off one another as if they were responding.
Yeah, and part of that is just the incorporation of other styles. Like, to me, even though we're sitting there, two guitars, we're playing in a very, what I would call like a 20th century classical type of style. The rhythms of music that both of us really liked, like we were a classical and a jazz player united over our love of the Foo Fighters, and so there was something about like all the other kinds of guitar that just slipped their way in there, and so there's some rock and like Steve Vai and those kind of references in there, and then there's I hear a lot of some of those pieces were sort of inspired by Ornette Coleman's work, some of what he did with the Skies Over America project, with the symphony and that kind of stuff. And so that to me was such a cool marriage of improvised and not improvised, or writing to sound improvised, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so to me, there's something really beautiful about that liminal space too.
Well, Jake, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat. I wanted to ask just real quickly a couple more questions. One was a lot of the people that listen to this are artists themselves, creatives in some form or fashion, and a variety of different platforms and methods that they use. Is there anything in particular, just as just wholly as an artist that is inspiring to you, or something you do on a daily basis that helps you concentrate and be better at your art form?
Well, I think there's sort of two things that to me, like, there's a connection to the fundamentals that's always so important. And in music, that tends to manifest itself in simple, almost meditative drilling of, in my case, it would be chords, scales, physical exercises that just, like, it keeps you grounded in where you started a little bit. Because to me, like, the projects I do can get far away from the guitar. So I have to bring it back to its center as much as possible. And that's always part of my practicing. And so whatever that means for any given medium, this idea of bringing it back to the center, the technique, the foundation of whatever your craft is, because I generally feel like that keeps getting better the longer you work on it. And so the kind of return to that, like, you never get past the fundamentals, no matter how wild or creative you're trying to be. Like, there's still a G major scale there that needs practice. You know?
My son picked up the guitar probably about 3 years ago. He's 13 now, and he's just recently gotten serious about it, say this last 6 months. And that one of the things, I can't remember where I read it, but a very similar piece of advice would be that you have to get past those fundamentals to actually hear the music.
Mm-hmm. And you know, they play a role in the grounding. They're not the music itself, but it's like what the music is grounded in. And I think the second thing is the opposite, which is just don't let anything not inspire you. And in some sense of like, whatever inspires you as a person will inspire you as an artist. They're not different things. You can't love sailboats as a person and not have that reflected in your creative life, for example. And so I think that when people are really in touch with and honestly in touch with who they are and what really inspires them as a person, that comes out in their artwork. And that's generally the stuff that will be the most authentic anyway. That's the stuff that other people want to experience with you.
Well, Jake, if someone was interested in reaching out and trying to get in contact with you, where would be the best place for them to look?
Probably my website. I think there's a contact form there. It's just www.jakehertzog.com. But if there's people that have any specific questions in regards to the music programs at U of A, they can find me on the University of Arkansas Music Department website as well.
Great. Well, we'll be sure to include some links to that in the show notes for everybody to reach out. Jake, again, thanks so much for your time. It's been an absolute awesome conversation, and I can't wait to see you in a couple of days here in El Dorado.
Oh, man, thank you so very much, and I look forward to seeing you.
All right.
us again next week for a deep dive into another art form with artists of all walks of life, where we get a chance to peek behind the curtain and attempt to tease out the secrets behind the creative process on Creatively.